Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for our first talk within our new alumni speaker series, where we invite alumni to share their work and career with fellow alumni and the greater CCAD community. My name is Brittany Bergamo Whalen, and I'm the Alumni Engagement Coordinator at CCAD, and I'm also an alum myself. Tonight, we're excited to be hosting David Hovey, Illustration 2009, to share some insight into what he's been up to since graduating. Before we get started, I'd love to share a little bit more about David. David is currently a media designer at McGraw-Hill Education. He worked in traditional media as a CCAD student, but pivoted to digital painting after graduation, where he continues to bring traditional sensibilities to his practice today. David has also worked for such companies as Victoria's Secret, Abbott, Fantasy Flight Games, Catalyst Games, and the Ohio Lottery. His favorite projects include Arkham Horror, Star Wars, and his illustrations for a textbook version of Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, for which he received the Columbus Society of Communicating Arts Best Illustration Award in 2020. David Hovey is based in Columbus, Ohio, where he lives with his wife, Kristen, and their two cats, Benny and June. A couple more things before we get started. We are recording tonight's presentation so that we can share it with you all afterwards and those who weren't able to join us tonight. And also, please feel free to use the chat or Q&A function throughout the presentation tonight if you have any questions for David. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce David as our speaker tonight. And David, I'll let you take it from here, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, let's get this started. All right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Brittany. And thanks to CCAD for the opportunity to talk at this alumni event. I'm David. I graduated in 2009, about 12 years ago. And in those 12 years, I've experienced a ton of false starts. I've been exposed to the limitations of my capabilities, and I've been forced to examine exactly what I want as an artist and as a professional. I am by no means at the end of that journey, but the School of Hard Knocks has taught plenty of lessons, and I took some notes. So I'm going to share 3 distinct stages of my art career so far, and some of the things that I learned while flailing wildly out in the real world. The first stage is immediately post-college, where I spent 3 years trying to get a commission that never came. The second is the start of my digital career, where I finally adapted to the market and started finding success. And the final stage is the last 5.5 years that I've been at McGraw-Hill Education, where I've learned to carve out a distinct role for myself as an artist in a more team environment. Finally, I'll show you some of my work process when it came to tackling the most challenging project of my career so far, Tom Sawyer, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A. So let's look at my senior portfolio. When I graduated from CCAD, I figured I'd be able to make a name for myself in traditional paint. There are, of course, still artists who can do that. In school, I looked up to illustrators like Phil Hale, Donato Giancola, James Gurney, Dan Dos Santos, John Foster, and I stayed away from digital painting for that reason. So I created all of my final portfolio in oils, and you can see from these images, I was shooting for book covers, maybe some editorial work. Some of these pieces, like that cowboy there, and the Scarlet Letter, the black and white piece from earlier, they're huge. They're 2 feet by 3 feet. And many of them are still hanging up on my walls. Anyways, this is the part of my story you need to take with a grain of salt, because I know for a fact that illustrators can be successful painting traditionally. But I wasn't. Fast forward 3 years, my new portfolio is still all oils. I even sold a few originals, but I hadn't gotten 1 commission in those 3 years. And I had only painted 10 pieces. Most of these, again, are still on my walls. The year is 2011. I'm working at Buffalo Wild Wings in Muncie, Indiana. I'm broke, I'm in debt, I'm upset. Something had to change. So I decided to switch to digital painting. Yes, these paintings came after those other paintings. No, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I quickly learned that digital painting was a whole different beast. I wasn't in school anymore, and wouldn't you know it, I didn't pay attention in the 2 digital painting classes I had. Why would I need to know how to paint with a computer? And of course, there's a whole language to computers that you don't have to learn with traditional paints. There are limitations too. As a painter, I know which colors are transparent, which ones are opaque. I know how they react to being layered onto the canvas. But with digital, you're in charge of all of those variables. I just want to pick up my paintbrush and paint. I don't want to have to pick the size and the opacity and the brush model. Working myself through the best practices of digital painting made the transition painful, to say the least. So let's talk about chicken wings. I was waiting tables at Buffalo Wild Wings, if you remember. The job was extremely formative to my art career. Being a server gave me 3 things. First and foremost, it got me enough tips that I could reinvest into my art. I bought an Intuos tablet and Photoshop. Second, waiting tables taught me the power of communication. Our restaurant would get so busy that people sometimes would wait for up to an hour. And once they sat down, the kitchen would be overrun with orders, so their food was going to come out late. If I made sure, however, that I was upfront and honest with how long the food would take, and made sure that the guests at the table felt cared for, it would change their entire dining experience. Nothing would make their food come out faster, but their perception of the night would change entirely based on how I communicated with them. That's an extremely powerful tool. And one time someone needed change, they needed 5 cents. And I asked them if they wanted their nickel back, and they said, oh, yeah. And I said, look at this phone. And they didn't laugh, and that's too bad because it was really funny. Anyways, third and finally, waiting tables made me motivated to never ever wait tables again. I know that sounds bad, but I actually count it as a good thing. I worked at Joann Fabrics for 3 years and in the custom frame shop, and because it was creative adjacent as a job, I didn't have much energy or motivation to change my circumstances. I enjoyed the work, but it didn't pay me enough to reinvest into what I needed to do. It took me 1 year of serving chicken wings and beer to give me the motivation I needed to change my life. It also gave me a lifelong obsession with chicken wings. So now I had Photoshop, I had a drawing tablet, I needed someone who would hire me for my truly crappy digital illustrations until I learned the ropes, so of course I got on Craigslist. I found a guy who was making an RPG game, and he needed a ton of original artwork for his universe. Even better, he accepted my awful art. I eventually made 12 pieces for him. I don't know if they were ever published. I know I was never paid. Pro tip, if someone says they'll pay after profit, you'll probably never get paid. But the projects were still worth it because they gave me experience with an art director, they let me cut my teeth on digital painting, and they gave me a fully digital portfolio to take to the next project. Sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. Some more work from his universe with varying levels of success. It was like a steampunk kind of fantasy realm. Again, I don't know if it exists anymore. So it's 2012, the Mayan apocalypse just barely missed us, and I have a new portfolio made up of the work that you saw already, made for Craigslist, with a few of personal pieces like these sprinkled in. It was time to contact a new client. So I emailed Shadowrun. Now, if you don't know the brand, think Dungeons and Dragons meets cyberpunk. Their art director said I could probably work for them, but since I didn't have any experience, he wanted me to do an art test. So he sent me 3 art specs, and he asked me to pick one and illustrate it. If he liked it, he'd hire me, and if he didn't, no harm, no foul. So I painted the first spec, and I sent it, and I didn't hear back for a week or two. So I picked the next spec and I painted it and I sent him another email. By the way, if you're a student, don't take me literally here and actually annoy an art director, but painting someone with new art is not a bad call. Here's the second piece. Just so you know, these were illustrated according to a description. Some of them don't age as well as others. So at this point, my plan was to produce a new piece every week until he either gave me a commission or a restraining order. Thankfully, after the second piece, he responded, the first email got buried, so he didn't see it at first. But he liked both pieces enough that he immediately sent me my first real published commission. It was 2 black and white half-page images. And they're still very near and dear to my heart. From there, I started working consistently with Shadowrun. They're fun, but their aesthetic is a little busy, a little neon. Their art director actually gave me one of the best guides for illustrating science fiction fantasy, and I use it still today, which is make sure your character, no matter what they're doing, is always a badass. The aesthetic of Shadowrun, again, a little busier than I like, but it's always fun. It's always interesting. It's not often that you get a prompt to paint a guy getting thrown off a building with a sword through his chest. I don't get that at McGraw-Hill very often. Maybe for their science textbooks, but when I felt I was good enough, I contacted another art director, and this time it was for Alderac Games. Rinse and repeat. I contacted another art director, this time Fantasy Flight Games. If you know me or my friends, you'll probably catch glimpses of their faces in my paintings, and of course, plenty of my own face. This is, again, Fantasy Flight, but it's such a cool property to be able to say I got to work on Star Wars stuff. So in 2014, I moved back to Columbus and I got hired by a little casino app company called Sidebolt Studios. Here, I got to learn the volatility of this profession. I was hired as an intern to paint splash screens like this one and backgrounds for slots games when the company had easily 10 to 15 employees. But a few months later, our animators were gone, our sound guys were gone, all but one coder had left. Within the year, I was illustrating backgrounds, I was building UI, and I was animating. You can see some of the animations that I worked on, like the ice breaking apart here and the little snowflakes, or the Little Mermaid here and her shark friend that we'll see in just a second. Very scary. It was a lot of fun, great learning experience. By the end of the year, I was an art director. And 4 months later, they called the rest of the artists into the office and let us all go. From there, I worked with Portfolio Creative. They're a Columbus-based artist headhunting company. I really liked working with them. That's how I got to work for a few months with Victoria's Secret. And then in October of 2015, I was hired at McGraw-Hill Education. When I was first hired, I was asked to make really simple pieces, tech art like this, for the science program. But then a social studies book came through and they needed a much more realistic style. And that's when I raised my hand and said, hey, I do realistic paintings. Hey, I do portraits. I can do these things. And when they needed some illustration assets for animation, I raised my hand again. And I said, hey, I've done that before. Shout out, by the way, to fellow illustrator, CCAD alum, James Haskins, who worked on that piece with me. So I made it a habit of going to my managers and saying, hey, I can do what you're asking of me, no problem. But if you need more, I can do more. Here are my capabilities. At McGraw-Hill, I was forced to reevaluate many of the things that I had learned. art and business, especially corporate business, are kind of at odds with one another. As an artist, I'm constantly wanting the time to produce the very best image and product that I can, but the company has to publish a product sometime. They have a budget, and when you're an in-house artist, your time is very literally their money. So when a huge project like social studies comes through with over 70 animated videos for a small in-house production team and a tight deadline, part of the creativity comes from trying to balance quality of work with quantity of work. Much of my job now is as much problem solving as it is painting. Here is the biggest, scariest word I hear at McGraw-Hill: scalability. Scalability in this context refers to how replicable an art style is. So take videos, for instance. At first, I wanted to create detailed, complicated illustrations. My goal is to create really gorgeous animations. But with 70 videos for the program, the time this would take is simply unrealistic. So how do you create a style of illustration that can scale to 70 videos while still maintaining a high quality look? That kind of long-term problem solving was new to me. And yet, sometimes I'm arguing against scalability. McGraw-Hill licenses anything they don't wholly own: pictures, videos, the works. So much of their budget is spent hunting down images, working out permissions and licensing. But if an in-house photographer or illustrator makes a piece, they own that asset forever, without having to pay licensing fees every time. Part of advocating for myself as an in-house artist is tying my work to real definable values. I save you $200 on X illustration every time this book gets published because I made it as a wholly owned asset. So finding the right balance for every piece turns out to be a fun puzzle that keeps me engaged from project to project. I've also learned more about communication. Again, yeah. The more people you bump up against, the more complex it gets. As a freelancer, I only work with one person, the art director. As an in-house illustrator, I communicate with my manager, other illustrators, academic designers, media designers, and content licensing, just to name a few. Each of these departments has their own goals and priorities, and building relationships with these, what they call cross-functional teams, makes a huge difference in the end product. Working as a team means that sometimes feedback is as much about truth as it is about morale. And often how you communicate is just as important as what you communicate. You hear these corporate sounding buzzwordy phrases like positive solution forward thinking. And what that really means is I'm a problem solver and people like working with me because I don't step on toes. Is corporate jargon all good? No. But it's a fascinating tightrope to walk, balancing between polite or forthright in search of the best way to communicate complex ideas to a team. All right, let's get back to the art talk. Toward the end of 2019, I was given the opportunity to work on McGraw-Hill's version of Tom Sawyer. It's an intervention reading program, so it's rewritten slightly to help teach reading concepts to students who need a little extra help. The fun part of all that is that I was in a remedial reading course when I was in 5th grade. I read Tom Sawyer, and for some assignments, I illustrated scenes from the book. So take that, 5th grade. The cool part about creating this project as an in-house illustrator was that I got to use McGraw-Hill facilities. So we hired child models through an agency that MHE works with, rented costumes, and I shot reference in the photo studio. Once the deadlines got too difficult, and we'll get to that in a minute, I was able to rope in a fellow illustrator, Max Yeager, who I am forever thankful to, and he eventually helped finish 6 of the final 30 images. Here's the breakdown. Tom Sawyer was 30 illustrations broken into 6 batches, 5 illustrations per batch. batch. Over months, when I counted every single day, 92 business days, I shot over 500 reference photos, and I put about 1,000 hours of work into this sucker. Every photo, sketch, screenshot, and final put together weighs 13.8 gigabytes. Now, if you count all the days allotted for each step, those 19 days of production, and you multiply it by the number of batches, you get 114 days. That math is off. So it might give you a little preview of how ambitious the timeline was on this project. You see, a batch would be released every 2 weeks. And while each phase of the illustration was followed by review time, for instance, 5 days of sketches was followed by 11 days of review time, when that time was over, the next phase would begin immediately. Batch overlap didn't push any deadlines. So at any one time, I would be working on rendering for one batch, colors for another, and sketches for a third. This was, what's the word for it? Not ideal. But like I said, I was able to tackle most of this with a regimented schedule and help from my fellow illustrators. So let's take a look at the day in the life of one illustration in particular. So this is what I get when I get the order. I have a description of the illustration. Sometimes I get a little sketch, and then I get like a little segment of the story that the illustration actually goes with. The first 2 days get devoted to building compositions. This helps me plan for shooting reference on the models, with the models on the third day. The third day, we set up in the studio. That means lighting, props, anything I can get my hands on. I drag all my fellow employees into the room. They're a lot of fun, but it was a lot of work too. And then on the 4th and 5th day, I would finalize the drawings with help from the reference. Then they'd be sent to the AD to review. Once the review came back, I'd start on the color phase. I'd establish mood and atmosphere with color studies. And you can see I have this like loose brush that I use, and I get really loose with it because the more I build it up, the more traditional it actually looks in the final. So that's kind of fun. Remember, I'm doing 5 of these every batch. This is the color studies that I turned in for batch 2. And you can see that I'm trying to do a little bit more rendering. I don't do just flat colors for everything. You know, I get 8 days here and then 4 days for rendering, which means I need to find the time where I can get it and try and get this stuff complete as fast as possible. So I get into the rendering stage, and again, like I said, I cheat just a little bit. Since I have 8 days for color, I'll render at that phase. And sometimes I have to render once it comes back and it's the final stage, quote unquote. I really just had to grasp it every hour I could get. And between these two, you can see some revisions here and there. Huckleberry's hat gets a little smaller. The shadow gets put on the tombstone to pop Outlaw Joe out of the background. I got lucky with this project. Most of the time, I didn't have to make huge revisions to my compositions once I shot reference. But there was one instance, and of course, it had to do with the most complex piece that I painted for this project. This is my final. No, this is the court scene. They required 6 recognizable characters: the sheriff, the judge, a lawyer, Tom, Muff, his name's Muff, and Joe. So I sent them this scribble. And they said, yeah, it looks good. And then I refined it for the color study, and they said, no, it looks bad. So I had to go back and shoot new reference and redraw. So here's the redraw. And here's me shoving all of the reference into one image so I can paint it. Again, God bless every single one of these beautiful people who helped me take pictures These are my fellow employees, and I miss them dearly since I've been working from home during the pandemic. And here's the final. Again, this was one of 5 illustrations. I'm still actively finishing the other batches. And again, I got help from Max, who stepped in, took 6 pieces, and allowed me to finish something as detailed as this for the book. So incredibly grateful to have a team like that behind my back. So now I'll show you a few of my favorite pieces. I wish I could have been more ambitious with angles, with perspective. My mother-in-law posed for this one. I'm sure she'll be happy to have me call that up. I'd probably give each of these paintings another 10 hours if I could, but over time, as I worked on these, I learned where to concentrate my efforts and where to put the details. Especially when art requests didn't get any simpler to help me save time. I would have loved to dig into the details of every member of this crowd, but at some point, I had to perform art triage and making sure I hit the most important parts of the image and then just leave well enough alone. It really was like art boot camp, though. Getting out of it, by the end of it, I knew exactly how to paint a hand with 10 brushstrokes. That's not true. I'm lying. But I got better at painting, I'll tell you that. And you can see, as we go along, I get much more confident as this project continues. Some of these even get that like Hardy Boys flair and energy. Or maybe like an Arkham look. A lot of nighttime adventures for Tom Sawyer. I forgot to put jackets on the kids in this image. The spec asked for it. And so I had to put jackets on them. I missed the contrast that it gave them in the dark cave. But do what you gotta do. I didn't forget the second time. It was truly a joy to paint some of these. And the child models were so professional and just so cute. It was a lot of fun. And now the book is out. I actually have no idea how to order it, but 2 cool things. First, they sent me one for free. And second, Tom Sawyer is a standalone story. Aside from some of the context building at the beginning, the whole book is Tom Sawyer. So that's pretty darn cool. And that's where I stand today. I'd say my career went directions I never expected it to go, and yet I ended up doing things I'd always been told I would do. For instance, I made this yogurt label in junior year of college. And at the time I rolled my eyes like, never gonna do this again. Why am I doing this? And then I end up doing these banner illustrations for McGraw-Hill. Thanks, junior year. Or I remember doing an assignment about an ecosystem with all these animals in this environment. And I thought, when would I ever make an ecosystem? I did 6 of these. I'm not going to show you all of them. Not a week goes by that I'm not reminded of a lesson that I learned about composition or color theory. And much of my work now deals with describing the how and why of design choices to others at the company. It's been a long 12 years, but I've taken important lessons from every twist and turn in my story. Before we start the Q&A, I wanted to share the most recent lesson that I've learned, and that's gratitude. The pandemic has put a lot of things into perspective, I'm sure, for all of us. I'm grateful to the other artists that I work with, truly gracious and talented people, Dave Armstrong, James Haskins, Brooke Johnson, Michael Hill, Max Yeager. I'm grateful to the people who follow me on my tiny little social media presence. Just that little bit of support, feeling heard, makes a world of difference. Many of those people I met at CCAD when I didn't fully understand the power of artistic community. And I'm really, truly grateful for the opportunity to share with all of you. 10 years ago, when I wasn't sure where I was going, what I was doing with my career, I would think about the guest speakers that came to CCAD, and I'd imagine that one day I too would get the opportunity to share. So this truly is a bucket list item for me. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing my story, and hopefully in another 10 years, I'll have another good story to tell. But until then, thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thanks, David. So we do have a couple of questions if we can jump into those. So one, somebody asked or said, I'd love to hear more specifically about your project with Star Wars, if there's some more information you can give about that.
Sure. I'm just going to keep the video of me painting up. I don't.
Sure.
Yeah, Star Wars was cool. They do multiple runs, so they'll have like Star Wars Rogues and Star Wars, so every once in a while you'll get to do one of the big characters. I think one of the first paintings I did was Obi-Wan, the moment he feels the loss of the planet. Trying to think of what that planet was called now. He goes, there's been a great disturbance in the force, and he kind of like leans over. So part of the process with those is you have, and I've even done like Han Solo too, you're trying to show a scene that's not ripped straight from the movie. So you end up like dressing up your friends or yourself and then like kind of trying to transpose the movie star's face on their face. So I would say that's the biggest part of doing those. It's not as, how do I put this? They kind of come to you and they say, we want this guy, he's an assassin, he should be looking this way, send us sketches. So there's not much allure to it aside from, hey, I got to paint this and now here it is.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question. Can you give a little bit more of a look into what your day-to-day is typically as a media designer at your company?
Yeah, I often describe it as spinning plates. I've got multiple things that I'm doing at any one time because McGraw-Hill does science books, they do math books, they do social studies books, excuse me, and each illustrator that I work with, we each have our talents specific to us. But someone will come in, like for instance, just yesterday in the morning, I was working on a watercolor style digital painting for a poem. And then in the afternoon, I'm doing vectors for video work. So every day kind of shifts. I usually get on these big projects like Tom Sawyer, right? 4 months. Right now I'm working on social studies videos. It's been going on for a year, a little over a year now. And so every Monday and Tuesday, I get in these meetings and we storyboard something. We literally just get this big block of text and we tell stories to each other and we go, how would we say so-and-so president was elected, but visually. And so that's a lot of fun, right? And then my job is doing outlines and then doing vectors, and then doing a portrait for another program. So it's kind of just like everyone comes at you from different angles, and then you speed that plate up and you set it aside and you get another plate and you just keep trying to finish projects. Does that answer it? Is that you want my day to day, like hour to hour? I get up, I have coffee, check my emails, start painting.
No, I think that was a really good answer. And I actually had one more question. So you've talked a lot about of your favorite projects and things that you've really enjoyed working on. Have there ever been moments where there have been challenges for you to get motivated to work on something because you're not as excited about it?
Yeah, yeah. I guess I've been kind of lucky because I enjoy the process. I enjoy some of the problem solving. So I guess sometimes I'll get a project, like for instance, these, I'm going to tell you what I'm interested in versus what I wasn't. But, like the social studies videos, sometimes, it's not this painterly style that I usually enjoy producing, but the history that we're telling these like, it's a supplement to the program. So we're telling stories that aren't told very often. And they're so interesting and sometimes so heartbreaking or so hopeful. And so being able to give voice to that, that motivates me, even if the style of art itself doesn't. So oftentimes it's trying to find what keeps me motivated to do it. I stall out more often on personal projects. I'm like, I'm really interested in this. And then I get halfway through, I'm like, this is going to take another 20 hours. And so a lot of times it's less about like motivation and more about like, if I don't enjoy it, I go, what's the puzzle part? What's the part of the problem that I'm solving? And that's fun.
Awesome. That's a really good way to look at that. Well, we don't have any other questions that have come in at the moment. So if there's anything else that you wanted to share, you can definitely feel free to give us any more information that you might, or we can work towards wrapping things up for the night.
Did I not give you enough?
Oh, you gave plenty. I've learned so much. All of this process, I was like, wow, illustration is definitely not my background, but I feel like I'm leaving this with a lot of information that I did not know before.
No, I think I probably said as much as I've got to say. You gave me the mic and I shouted for as long as I could.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate that. So before we go, maybe we can switch where I share. I just have one more slide for announcements.
Yeah, of course.
And then we can call that a night. Let's see. Let me take over really quick. Get to my announcements page. So thanks so much again for sharing everything that you did with us tonight, David. And before we go, I just wanted to share some information about another upcoming alumni speaker event with Leah Nalbantato, Media Studies 1991. This event will be virtual as well and will take place on Thursday, April 22nd at 12 p.m. EDT. And then please also keep an eye out for additional alumni events throughout the year. As these are confirmed, we'll share information about these events through CCAD's website, alumni Facebook, and the alumni email newsletter. And you can sign up for the newsletter to stay in the loop at ccad.edu/alumni. And one last thing, if any alum is interested in potential speaking opportunities, or if you know of another alum who might be interested, definitely feel free to let me know, and you can contact me at alumni@ccad.edu. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining tonight, and thank you again to David. And I hope you all have a good night, and thanks everyone.